The last thing I saw before I died was my husband's smile. It was the same smile I had fallen in love with 10 years ago when we were both 22 and the world was full of promise. The same smile he had given me on our wedding day when he lifted my veil and whispered that I was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. The same smile he was giving me now, standing over my hospital bed in the ICU of New York Presbyterian, his hand wrapped around my foreline, pulling it slowly, deliberately from my arm. "You've been sick for so long, Elena," he said, his voice soft and tender. "Everyone understands. The doctors said you weren't going to make it anyway. This is just speeding things along." I tried to speak, and my throat was raw from the ventilator, and my body was a ruin of pain and exhaustion, ravaged by the leukemia that had been devouring me for 3 years. I had been in this bed for 6 weeks, drifting in and out of consciousness, while my husband Julian Ashford managed my care, my finances, my life. I had trusted him with everything. He was my husband. He was supposed to protect me. Instead, he had been poisoning me. The setbacks the doctors couldn't explain, the sudden drops in my white blood cell count, the infections that appeared from nowhere. All of it was him. And now, with my death imminent and the prenuptial agreement about to expire, he was finishing the job. "Sabine sends her love," he added, his smile widening. "She wanted to be here, but she's getting fitted for her wedding dress. Ivory silk. You would have liked it. Very classic. Very elegant. Sabine Morode, MY former assistant. MY closest friend. The woman who had visited me every week with flowers and magazines and whispered prayers for my recovery. She had been sleeping with my husband for 5 years. She had been helping him drain our joint accounts for 3. And in 6 months, when the prenuptial agreement's adultery clause expired, she would marry him in the cathedral where we had exchanged our vows. I watched Julian's fingers wrap around my oxygen tube. I watched his smile widen. And then I felt the darkness closing in, and the last thing I heard before the world went silent was his voice, calm and satisfied. "Goodbye, my love. Thank you for everything." Then there was nothing, and then there was light. System initializing. Host detected. Elena Vance Ashford. Status. Deceased. Cause. Murder by medical tampering, premeditated spousal homicide. Compatibility, 99.7%. Activating karmic rebirth protocol. You have been wronged beyond mortal measure. You are granted one chance to return. Use it to balance the scales. Initiating temporal rewind, 5 years. I open my eyes to the familiar ceiling of my bedroom, our bedroom. The penthouse on Park Avenue, with its silk wallpaper and its panoramic views of Central Park, the same bedroom where I had spent a decade loving a man who was planning to kill me. The date on my phone was June 15th, 0.5 years before my murder, 2 years before Julian would begin poisoning my medications. 3 years before Sabine would start visiting me in the hospital with her poison flowers and her poisonous smile. I was 32 years old. I was healthy. I was alive. And somewhere in the city, my husband and his mistress were waiting to destroy me. Not this time. The system flickered in my peripheral vision, its translucent blue interface offering me a choice. I could confront Julian immediately, expose his crimes, and watch him squirmed. Or I could wait. I could plan that I could spend the next 5 years building an empire so vast and so unassailable that when the moment of reckoning came, he would never see it coming. I chose patience. And patience, it turned out, was the deadliest weapon of all. The first thing I did was contact my mother's family. My mother, Genevieve Vance, had died when I was 19, leaving me her entire fortune in a trust that Julian had convinced me to let him manage. He had been siphoning money from that trust for years, small amounts at first, then larger still to be by the time of my death. He would have drained it entirely. My mother's sister, Margaret Vanston, was a retired federal judge who had been estranged from our family since my mother's funeral. Julian had told me she was toxic and manipulative, and I had believed him that I had let him isolate me from the one woman who could have protected me. I called her that morning. She answered on the second ring. "Aunt Margaret," I said, "I need your help. Julian has been stealing from me, and I'm going to destroy him." There was a long silence. Then Margaret Vanston laughed, a cold, sharp sound that was more approving than amused. "I've been waiting for this call for 10 years. Tell me everything." I told her the embezzlement, the affair, the murder, the one that, in this timeline, hadn't happened yet. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, her voice was as calm as if we were discussing the weather. "I have a legal team of 47 attorneys that I have forensic accountants who can trace every dollar he's stolen, and I have been building a dossier on Julian Ashford since the day you married him. He's been bribing city officials. He's been hiding assets in offshore accounts. He's been running a shell company that launders money for at least 3 criminal enterprises. If you want to destroy him, Elena, I can give you the tools, but you have to be the one to wield them." "Show me," I said. She showed me. For the next 5 years, I became 2 people. Publicly, I was the same devoted wife Julian had always known, quiet, accommodating, utterly blind to his lies. Privately, I was a predator in waiting. I worked with Margaret's forensic accountants to trace every dollar Julian had stolen. I documented every affair, every bribe, every crime. I opened my own investment accounts, quietly building a portfolio that would eventually rival Julian's entire net worth. I reconnected with my mother's family, the Vance dynasty that Julian had been so determined to keep me from. The Vance family, I learned, was not just wealthy. They were titans. Margaret Vanston, my aunt, controlled a legal empire that spanned 3 continents. My cousin, Adrian Vance, was the CEO of Vance International, a conglomerate with interests in energy, real estate, and defense. And my grandmother, the woman Julian had told me was dead, was very much alive. Eleanor Vance was 92 years old, the matriarch of a dynasty worth more than $60 billion, and she had been waiting for her granddaughter to come home. She's the one, my grandmother said when Margaret brought me to her estate in the Hamptons. She was tiny and frail, but her eyes were as sharp as cut glass. She has my eyes, M-Y-J-A-W, and why stubbornness. Julian Ashford thought he was marrying a nobody. He had no idea he was marrying a Vance. She took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Make him pay, child, and when you're done, come home. The empire has been waiting for its heiress. I promised her I would, and I kept my promise. The wedding was on a Saturday in June, 5 years to the day after my rebirth. Julian Ashford was marrying Sabine Moreau at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the same cathedral where he had married me. He had chosen the same flowers, white roses and peonies, and the same string quartet. He had even sent out invitations with the same gold lettering. IT was as if you were trying to recreate the perfect wedding, the perfect crime, the perfect victim. He didn't know that the perfect victim had become something else entirely. The cathedral was packed with 700 guests. Sabine walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, her face radiant, her hand resting on the arm of her father. Julian waited at the altar, his smile the same smile he had given me on our wedding day. The priest began the ceremony. The guests settled into their seats. The string quartet played something soft and forgettable. And then, just as the priest asked if anyone had any objections, the cathedral doors burst open. I walked down the aisle. Not as a ghost, not as a memorate A.S. Elena Vance, the woman who owned half the companies in the room. The woman who had spent 5 years building a case so devastating that it would take the prosecution 6 months just to read the indictment. The woman who was about to burn Julian Ashford's empire to the ground. I wore a gown of deep crimson, not white, never white again, and my grandmother's rubies at my throat. Behind me walked my Aunt Margaret, flanked by a dozen attorneys carrying boxes of documents. Behind them walked 2 federal agents and a representative from the New York Attorney General's office. "Hello, Julian," I said, my voice carrying across the silent cathedral. "Did you miss me?" The color drained from Julian's face so fast I thought he might collapse. Sabine screamed and stumbled backward, clutching her bouquet like a shield. The priest dropped his Bible. 700 guests erupted in chaos, phones lifting, cameras flashing, voices shouting over one another in a cacophony of shock and confusion. "You're supposed to be dead," Julian whispered. "You're supposed to be. The leukemia was supposed to..." "The leukemia never existed, Julian. You fabricated the diagnosis. You paid a doctor $300,000 to poison me with medications I didn't need. You drained my trust fund, sold my shares, and told everyone I was dying. And then, when I was too weak to fight back, you were going to finish the job. What was it you said to me in the hospital? This is just speeding things along. You were going to kill me, but I didn't die, I got better, and I've spent 5 years documenting every crime you've ever committed." "She's lying," Julian shouted, his composure shattering. "This woman is insane. She's a fraud. My wife died 3 years ago. Your wife is standing right here, and she has a lot to say." I turned to face the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Elena Vance. I am the granddaughter of Eleanor Vance, the founder of Vance International. I am the majority shareholder of 17 companies, including 3 that Julian Ashford claims to own. I am also the woman he married 10 years ago, the woman he's been systematically defrauding since our wedding night, and the woman he was planning to murder so he could inherit my fortune and marry his mistress. I have the evidence," I continued, gesturing toward the attorneys behind me. "Bank records, wire transfers, emails, recorded conversations. The testimony of the doctor Julian bribed to fabricate my leukemia diagnosis, the testimony of the pharmacist who supplied the medications that were supposed to kill me, and the testimony of Sabine Moreau, who has agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for immunity." Sabine's face went white. "What? I never, Julian, she's lying. I never agreed to anything." "You agreed to plenty," I said coldly. "You just didn't know you were being recorded." I pulled out my phone and pressed a button. Sabine's voice filled the cathedral, a conversation she had with Julian 3 weeks ago in what she thought was the privacy of their apartment. "Once Elena is dead, we'll have everything," she had said. "Her trust fund, her shares, her real estate. We'll be set for life. Just be patient. Julian, she's almost gone." The cathedral was utterly silent. Sabine collapsed against the altar, her face a mask of terror and disbelief. Julian lunged toward me, his hands outstretched, his face twisted with fury. "You bitch. I'll kill you. I'll kill you right here." But the federal agents were faster. They intercepted him before he had taken 3 steps, pinning his arms behind his back, snapping the handcuffs around his wrists. He screamed my name, threats, pleas, apologies, all of it dissolving into the chaos of the crowd. Sabine was handcuffed beside him, her ivory wedding dress catching on the pews, her mascara streaming down her face in black rivers. Julian Ashford, the lead agent, announced, "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, embezzlement, bribery, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." Julian didn't remain silent. He shouted my name until his voice cracked, until the agents dragged him through the cathedral doors, until the heavy oak swung shut behind him and cut off his voice like a guillotine. Sabine followed, her sobs echoing through the stone arches, her perfect wedding ruined beyond repair. The cathedral emptied slowly. Guests filed out in stunned silence, their phones still recording, their mouths still agape. The priest retreated to his sacristy, his face pale and shaken. The string quartet packed up their instruments with trembling hands. And I stood alone at the altar where I had once pledged my life to a murderer, and I felt, for the first time in 5 years, at peace. My Aunt Margaret approached, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and placed her hand on my shoulder. "It's done," she said. "The legal process will take years, but he'll never see the outside of a prison cell again. You did it, Elena. You won." "I didn't win," I said. "I survived. There's a difference." She nodded slowly. "Yes, there is. But surviving is its own kind of victory." We walked out of the cathedral together into the bright June sunlight. The street was chaos, reporters, photographers, satellite trucks, the entire machinery of media descending on the scandal of the decade. My grandmother's car was waiting at the curb, a black Maybach with tinted windows and a liveried driver. "Where to, Madame Vance?" the driver asked. I looked out the window at the cathedral, at the crowd, at the life that had almost been taken from me. "Home," I said. "Take me home." Third-party objective commentary. The structural brilliance of this revenge narrative lies in its temporal architecture. The author constructs a protagonist who exploits the 5-year gap between rebirth and reckoning with the patience of a chess grandmaster. Unlike conventional rebirth narratives where the heroine immediately confronts her betrayers, Elena Vance employs a long-game strategy that transforms her from passive victim into active predator while maintaining the perfect cover of domestic compliance. The cathedral confrontation scene is a masterclass in dramatic escalation. The author layers revelations with surgical precision. First the visual shock of the crimson dress against the white wedding, then the verbal disclosure of the fabricated leukemia, then the documentary evidence of the bribery, and finally, the coup de grace, the recorded voice of Sabine herself condemning both conspirators. Each revelation builds on the previous one, creating a cascade of devastation that leaves the villains no ground to stand on. The detail of Julian's own recorded confession, "This is just speeding things along," is particularly effective because it weaponizes his words from the murder that has not yet happened against him in a timeline where he cannot explain them. The use of Sabine as the final piece of evidence is narratively satisfying because it turns the mistress into the instrument of her own destruction. She thought she was conspiring in private. Instead, she was creating the evidence that would condemn them both. Her immunity deal, granted by the heroine, not the state, represents a complete inversion of the power dynamic that defined their previous relationship. The mistress who once visited the wife with poisoned flowers now depends on the wife's mercy for her freedom. The crimson dress deserves special attention as a symbolic choice. White is the color of the victim, the bride, the patient, the corpse. Red is the color of the survivor. Blood, passion, and vengeance. By choosing to wear red to Julian's wedding, Elena visually announces that she has transcended the role he assigned her. She is no longer the sacrificial lamb on the altar of his ambition. She is the fire that will consume that altar entirely. The trial of Julian Ashford was the most sensational corporate crime prosecution in a generation. The evidence my legal team had gathered was overwhelming. 47 boxes of documents, testimony from 23 witnesses, and a paper trail that stretched across 7 countries and 14 bank accounts. Julian was convicted on 31 counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, embezzlement, bribery, and money laundering. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sabine Moreau, who testified against Julian in exchange for immunity on the murder conspiracy charge, was convicted on lesser counts of fraud and obstruction of justice. She received 8 years in a federal penitentiary. I heard she spends her days in the prison library, reading romance novels and writing letters of apology that will never be answered. Her wedding dress, the ivory silk gown she never got to wear down the aisle, was sold at auction, the proceeds donated to a foundation for victims of domestic violence. I reclaimed control of my mother's fortune. I restructured the companies Julian had looted, firing the executives who had enabled his crimes and promoting the employees who had tried to warn me. I established a charitable foundation in my grandmother's name, funding research into the rare diseases that Julian had pretended I had. And I wrote a memoir, a best-selling account of my marriage, my murder, and my rebirth that spent 82 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. I never visited Julian in prison, but I did send him a letter once, a single sheet of cream-colored paper with only 4 words written on it. Asterisk, I hope it was worth it. Asterisk, I never received a reply, but the warden later told me that Julian wept when he read it. Good, I wanted him to weep. I wanted him to understand, every single day for the rest of his miserable life, exactly what he had thrown away. 15 years after the cathedral confrontation, I stood on the rooftop of Vance Tower, looking out at the city that I now owned more of than anyone else alive. My company, Vance International, renamed and rebuilt, was the largest privately held conglomerate in North America, and my foundation had funded medical research that had saved thousands of lives. My memoir had inspired a generation of women to document their own abuses, to fight their own battles, to refuse to be erased. My grandmother had died 3 years after the trial, peacefully, in her sleep, with her hand in mine. My Aunt Margaret had retired to a villa in Tuscany, where she tended a garden full of roses and sent me unsolicited legal advice every Sunday. I was not married. I had no children. But I had something rarer and more precious, a life that was entirely, completely, irrevocably my own. I pulled Julian's letter from my pocket, the one he had sent me from prison after his first year of incarceration. I had read it only once, but I carried it with me always as a reminder of what I had survived. The words were smeared with what might have been tears. Asterisk Elena, I'm sorry. I know now what I destroyed. I know now that I loved you in my own broken way and that I threw it all away for nothing if I could go back. If I could do it all over again, I would choose you. I would always choose you. Asterisk. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in my pocket. Asterisk if I could go back. Asterisk the irony was almost too perfect. He couldn't go back. I did, and I had used my second chance to destroy him. The wife who was supposed to die became the woman who burned his empire to ashes, and she never looked back.